On Tuesday, the tragic news broke about what appeared to be an accidental Israeli airstrike in Gaza that killed 7 humanitarian aid workers, including 1 American, for the non-profit group World Central Kitchen. This was truly an unfortunate and tragic episode, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu immediately said as much in a video published on social media also on Tuesday. Multiple Israeli politicians and IDF commanders also expressed their apologies soon after. But we all know that Israel, and, by extension, the IDF, the Jewish army, is held to a standard that no other country or army is expected to even remotely uphold. And that is not even the craziest part of this story. A range of Jewish organizations even chimed in on the unfortunate event, and a few had harsh words for Israel. For example, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, CEO of the liberal rabbinic human rights group Truah, criticized, quote, Israel's failure to protect civilians, including deconflicted humanitarian organizations. Jacobs added, quote, while the incident must be fully investigated, it's clear that this is one more example of Israel failing to take proper measures to protect civilians, including humanitarian workers, too many of whom have already been killed in this war. I am reminded of something I saw on social media at the start of the war, which went like this. First, they came for the Jews who are politically conservative, and I did not speak up because I am not a conservative. Then they came for the Jews who are politically centrist, and I did not speak up because I am not a centrist. Then they came for the Jews who are Zionists, and I did not speak up because I am not a Zionist. Then they came for the Jews who are progressives, and I said, but I did and said everything you wanted, and they replied, yeah, but you are still a Jew. The extreme left-leaning Israel lobbyist organization J Street commented that it was, quote, utterly horrified by the bombing, and cited figures saying that almost 200 aid workers have been killed in the war. Mind you, these figures include quote-unquote aid workers who double as bona fide Palestinian terrorists or are forced to be Palestinian terrorists' human shields. But sure, blame Israel for every single death in Gaza, regardless of context, reason, intention, or any other reasonable premise. And then there was the response from Israel's best friend and greatest supporter. I am talking about U.S. President Joe Biden, who released a statement that says, and I quote, I am outraged and heartbroken by the deaths. Even more tragically, this is not a standalone incident. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of how many aid workers have been killed. This is a major reason why distributing humanitarian aid in Gaza has been so difficult, because Israel has not done enough to protect aid workers trying to deliver desperately needed help to civilians. Incidents like yesterday's simply should not happen. Israel has also not done enough to protect civilians. The United States has repeatedly urged Israel to deconflict their military operations against Hamas with humanitarian operations in order to avoid civilian casualties. End quote. Let me be clear about something. The Israelis screwed this one up, and I'm not making excuses for Israel's, quote, grave mistake, which are the State of Israel's words, in fact, hence the quotation marks. But to use this episode, as tragic as it is, to smear Israel with words like, this conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory, without mentioning the despicable, cowardly Palestinian terrorists who A, started this war and B, habitually create near impossible circumstances on a daily basis, is so disgustingly anti-Semitic. I literally cannot find the words to even begin to describe how hypocritical, cunning, and harmful Biden's words are. In other words, the U.S. president's statements have serious, potentially life-threatening consequences for Israeli hostages, Israeli soldiers, Israeli civilians, and Jews across the world, including in the United States of America. You know, where there are some 6 million Jews, the second largest Jewish population on planet Earth, and a population that, on the whole, has been pretty darn beneficial to the U.S. and Biden's Democratic Party, spanning decades. This is what makes Biden's statement incredibly bewildering, especially when we know that quote-unquote pro-Palestinian, really Jew-hating, mobsters will hear Biden's two-faced words and become even more encouraged to intimidate, bully, harass, and attack Jewish targets. And when Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders hear Biden's two-faced words, They sleep well, knowing that they can easily harden their negotiating positions with regard to the 100-plus hostages in their hands, including 6 Americans. The message is pretty damn clear from this president. If you are an American who gets kidnapped overseas, well, good luck. And we all know by now why Biden promoted such obnoxious and misplaced outrage. The Democrats are desperately losing Arab, Muslim, and progressive voters, who make up a small fraction of the overall American electorate, in swing states. These voters are threatening to sit out the upcoming presidential election if the Biden administration does not stop Israel from winning this completely justified, noble, and existential war against Hamas, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies. Heck, if the Biden administration is so outraged by the death of one American aid worker being tragically and accidentally killed, why are they not doing more to release the 6 American hostages who Palestinians are still holding for 180-plus days in Gaza? Apparently, Biden, quote, made clear to Netanyahu in a phone call on Thursday, quote, the need for Israel to announce and implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. End quote. Fine, that is fair. So where are the Biden administration's series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to release the 130-plus hostages, including 6 who hold American citizenship? We are now 6 months into these hostages living in the most horrific, inhumane conditions, including torture, physical and sexual assault, starvation, and fears of young female hostages being impregnated in captivity by Palestinian terrorists. In this regard, Biden has miserably failed both Israel and the American hostages and their families. Miserably. Don't you find it at least a little odd that the so-called most powerful person in this world, the U.S. president, seemingly refuses to seriously pressure America's quote-unquote great ally, Qatar, to put pressure on Hamas, a great friend of the Qataris, to release the hostages? Meanwhile, Israel has demonstrated during the last 180-plus days of war, as well as in several conflicts prior, that the Israelis are the most humanitarian military on this planet. But don't take it from me. Biden's fellow Americans have admitted so themselves. When he was Barack Obama's vice president, Obama sent U.S. military officials to Israel to learn how the Israelis keep civilian casualties exceptionally low, as the Obama administration was concerned about rising civilian deaths in the Syrian civil war. More recently, John Spencer, who spent more than 25 years in the U.S. military, including 2 combat tours during the Iraq War, said, quote, in my long career studying and advising on urban warfare for the U.S. military, I've never known an army to take such measures to attend to the enemy's civilian population, especially while simultaneously combating the enemy in the very same buildings. In fact, by my analysis, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires and more than the U.S. did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2015, while Biden was vice president, U.S. airstrikes destroyed a Doctors Without Borders trauma hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, killing 42 people, 6 times as many as the IDF accidentally killed on Monday. I am not saying that 2 wrongs make a right. Rather, I am reasonably supposing that a man whose own military has killed vast numbers of people in error would understand that these things unfortunately happen in the fog of war, no matter how many respectable people hope that mishaps like these will not take place. Yet Biden's administration is acting like the IDF must be more than perfect to continue receiving America's support. Yesterday, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said, quote, we will make sure Israel is never left without an ability to defend itself. At the same time, if there are not changes to their approach, it's very likely we're going to change our approach. What is Israel's approach exactly? Or is she really just saying that Israel is the only American friend who cannot make mistakes without manipulative ramifications that the U.S. would not apply to any other American ally? With all of this said, I have no doubt that the IDF has some bad apple soldiers who do not follow IDF protocol, sometimes accidentally and sometimes purposefully, just like every other army in the world, the U.S. notwithstanding. But you know what else is true? Israeli soldiers are human beings after all, not robots, which means they, like the rest of us, make imperfect decisions, calculations, and judgments, some that come with terrible consequences. And being a soldier is freaking insane. You do not sleep well for weeks on end, which naturally affects your perceptions and decision-making. If you are a reservist, and there are many in this war, you probably have a wife and children who are worried endlessly about you, and you about them, not to mention your parents, siblings, relatives, family, and colleagues. I did not even get to the part in which you are facing, on an hourly basis every single day, the cruelest of enemies in Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, who deliberately try to maximize as much death and destruction as humanly possible, because they know the world will blame Israel, while the IDF works both in theory and practice to minimize death and destruction on all sides. That is not my opinion. Israel's unworldly civilian-to-combatant ratio in this war is 1.5 to 1, and that is using Hamas's mathematically impossible numbers. This suggests that the IDF is doing an impeccable job, especially when you consider that the international average of civilian-to-combatant ratios, according to the United Nations, is 9 to 1. You see, it is easy for people to sit in their comfy, air-conditioned homes, offices, and media studios while they offer oversimplified judgments and opinions about the IDF. It is a whole other thing to be on the front lines of this horrific war that Israel was effectively forced to fight. 6 months into this thing, I still have not heard a realistic, pragmatic alternative to Israel's response. Yet I remain open to hearing one if it exists. What I have heard is that many Israeli soldiers are exhausted, traumatized, stressed out of their minds, and scared to death while bravely fighting this existential war which the other side started. And a war that in some ways has been prolonged by people like Biden and those in his administration who have implicitly forced Israelis to fight with one hand behind their backs, because, as a matter of fact, his party is overly and obsessively preoccupied with a few 100,000 Muslim and Arab voters and their few million progressive friends in a country of 330 million people. Biden and his Democrats' populist politics does not mean the IDF is free from fair, honest, nuanced, and respectful criticism. But for those who expect Israelis to essentially be perfect, they are actually a part of the problem in this war, and they too have innocents' blood on their hands, no matter how far away they may be from the Middle East.